Thank you, Kate. And yeah, every day when I walk through the streets of Dunedin and I pass the bit that had the medical school, I would think, oh, Kate used to be here. It's funny what you think about. One teeny correction, it's not so early here. It's actually 2 p.m., so I've even had lunch, so small hardship. So what I want to do today is to talk about the development of navigation and to talk about the mystery of how these little babies who actually can't navigate at all, I mean, it's wonderful, they can already sit up, but they're not going anywhere, become mobile creatures who can eventually sail around the world and produce maps and do all the things that adult humans can do in the way of navigation. And the reasons to be interested in development are several. And you know, one of them is just, oh, it's a mystery. Kids are cute. I wonder how they develop. You know, so there's that one. But I want to highlight 3 other reasons to care about development. One is because if you study mature human adults, and you have some model of navigation, you want to make sure that your model of how adults do it is one that you could build from the beginnings that we think babies begin with. So formal models, I think, sometimes founder on the idea that there's no way to get there from a beginning point. But of course, that invites the question of, well, what is the beginning point? Because there isn't a constraint unless you know what that point is. So that brings me to the second reason to care about development, which is it really raises key questions about human nature, and in particular, the centuries old and probably much older than that debate between a nativist, it's all inborn, in which case you're not really even developing, you're just making manifest what you already know, versus empiricist, where in the extreme, kids come with a blank slate and somehow mysteriously they have to build knowledge from pretty basic beginnings. And the last reason, and I'm not going to have really any time to talk about today, is that spatial skills, spatial learning, including navigation, which is a very particular type of spatial skill, I and others think are very relevant for education and various kinds of scientific reasoning, perhaps especially in geography, geoscience, the other geo disciplines, but so many things are laid out in space and you have a quote unquote map of sometimes a quite conceptual map of that conceptual territory, that there is increasingly the thought that that's important to many kinds of education that aren't on the face of them navigational or spatial. So I wanted to also you know, say a word about the plan of this talk and what I'm going to tell you about today, and also the level at which I'm going to describe it. So there's 3 parts. I want to start with theories of cognitive development, because I think if you don't study development, human development, it's sometimes hard to appreciate the extent to which it does revolve around this nativist empiricist debate that I've mentioned. Then I want to go over several classic questions, several hypotheses about how kids begin and how they change, which you may have heard of. Lots of you may have heard of Piaget, for instance, and I'll go a little bit into that. And that will allow me to develop the third sort of point, which is what I've been calling a neoconstructivist approach. Piaget was a constructivist, for those of you who don't recognize the term. Lots of what Piaget said was wrong, though, but I think there's a way to incorporate some of his insights in a novel kind of framework that's much more up to date. So I've talked about this at greater length in a 2019 overview I wrote for the Journal of Experimental Biology, from which this figure comes. I want to say 2 things about the figure. The first thing is that in general, what I'm doing in this talk is to give folks who care about academic references and who want to delve in more deeply, I'm trying to give you the references. What I hope to do is to give people a general flavor, because I appreciate that the audience probably includes people who are, not centrally engaged with research on cognitive development or even on cognitive aspects of navigation, give them a sense of what we know about development. The other thing I want to say about this figure is that it's an overview of my thinking about navigation, in which there are two sort of streams, the pink stream and the blue stream, which has nothing to do with gender. I forget why we made it pink and blue, probably a mistake. But we have what people call inertial navigation systems, which involve the sort of body-based senses like proprioception or visual flow, what the world looks like as it passes you. And we also have ways of pinning down where we are, what we call allocentrically, with regard to the framework around us, landmarks around us, distance from those landmarks, boundaries like streams or mountains, these kinds of things. And children have to develop within each of those systems. And the systems are typically immature at birth and change over time. Each of those streams contains several different systems. So for instance, there's visual flow and there's kinesthesis. There's specific landmarks that are sort of, the church tower or whatever, and there's general landmarks like the range of mountains. And integrating within those streams is part of what you begin to do better over the course of development. Another thing that happens in development is the pink and blue braid in the middle, which is those general streams of the pink and the blue can correct each other. In general, the inertial navigation, what I've been showing in pink, is sort of not very good, at least not in humans, and it needs to be corrected by information from landmarks. But on occasion, it's all we got, right? Like it's dark, or, we lack good vision for some other reason in terms of our eyes or whatever. There's a big fog. And you have to rely on a system that you wouldn't normally emphasize. So those are knit together. And then just over there in green, I have the idea that you have to deal with competing frameworks, that if different frameworks are giving you different information, you may have to inhibit or suppress those pieces of information. And that takes what cognitive psychologists often call inhibition, which is a sort of overarching, people talk about it as an executive function. So all of these are aspects of development. So with that somewhat long preamble, let me tell you about theories of cognitive development in a nutshell. I've organized this by whether people think that babies start weak or start strong, start with the tabula rasa or start with a lot of inborn knowledge. But also the rows are defined by whether you think that adults sort of don't know much either, or whether you think adults are wonderful navigators with great cognitive maps in the case of navigation. And there isn't anyone too sensible to put in the top right cell. I've put here a picture of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who isn't relevant to navigation, but who sort of thought babies were noble and you just sort of lose your moral compass as you get older. But by and large, we don't really think of that as a viable position. But the classic nativist empiricist debate is indeed defined by John Locke on the tabula rasa side in the lower left and Immanuel Kant on the innate knowledge side in the lower right. Now, in modern terms, we have certain psychologists who fit actually all three of the quadrants that I think are viable positions. In the John Locke quadrant in the lower left, we have Jean Piaget, And he thought you maybe started slightly stronger than tabula rasa, but not much stronger, basically with some sensory capacities and some reflexes, which is kind of what John Locke thought. But he really thought you got to a very strong, mature state. In the lower right, instead of Immanuel Kant, this is a picture of Elizabeth Spelke, who's probably the most prominent nativist theorist in contemporary cognitive development, who's written about lots of topics, but with respect to navigation, she's especially known for an hypothesis about the so-called geometric module, the idea that human babies share with non-human species, both the babies and the adults, an ability to sort where they are when they're disoriented, when they've lost their inertial navigation system by being turned around. That's why I'm gesturing like this. Using the relative length of boundaries. So things like the short wall is to the left of the long wall, and that it's only later that human adults become able to do more than that, to integrate other information, and that that's because of language. Now, in the top left, we have an interesting position I haven't talked about so far, in which there's not only weak starting points, there's also a weak mature state, which draws on the work of the Gibsons in perceptual development, but really deals with a controversy that is important in this area, which is whether or not there even is a cognitive map. It may be that adult navigation is guided at best by what Bill Warren, who's the person shown in the top left, calls a cognitive graph. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And this is where I put myself. I think that babies start stronger than Piaget thought, but I would not give them the kind of knowledge that Liz Spelke wants to give them. But I do believe that at least some human adults in some circumstances can form cognitive maps. So quickly, what did these various people say about spatial development? Well, Piaget for space says basically everything Piaget said about any topic in cognition, thought that babies not only start weak, but they stay weak until they're 9 or 10 years. So they have only topological knowledge. That is, they don't have any metric knowledge. At around 9 or 10, they develop two systems, which he contrasted, but they develop at exactly the same time, which involve the ability to use allocentric cues, and he actually said XY coordinates. Some people think it could be polar coordinates or whatever, but some sort of metric organizing rubric. And also the ability to say what another person would see from looking at a display from another side of a table. This is a task that he made famous called the Three Mountains task. Spelke, I've already told you actually about the geometric module, the idea that flexible reorientation using, in this case, you see a colored wall, the red wall there, doesn't appear until around 5 years, and that it's due to the intervention of language. Even a nativist needs to account on occasion for developmental change, and for Spelke, the way she does that is by invoking spatial language. Now, getting a little bit towards the cognitive map, cognitive graph controversy, I want to mention an old review chapter by Alex Siegel and Sheldon or Shep White, in which they talk about children as beginning with only landmark knowledge, which is allocentric, then getting root knowledge, which is either allocentric, oh, it's a sequence of landmarks, or you could think of it as inertial. I go, and then I go, and then I go, and, you know, and they never really specified what they had in mind. But ultimately getting to this survey knowledge, this kind of overview, or really a cognitive map. Their approach, though, wasn't just about development. They also said that when adults are learning new environments, they begin back with landmarks, they build up roots, and then they get to survey knowledge. So it's not exactly a developmental theory, but it sort of is. But it does commit to survey knowledge, which does bring me to the cognitive map, cognitive graph kind of controversy. So a cognitive map is Euclidean based. It doesn't necessarily use XY coordinates, although XY is what's shown in this figure in the lower left. But you can set in some abstract overview the location of each to be located object, and then essentially read off the relations among all those objects, any particular pair. From any position, you can take a bearing on one other position and then say where a third position is. All of those things are very flexible. Another view is the cognitive graph view, in which you know roots, but you know more than just the we get here, then we turn right, we get there, then we turn left, etc. You also know a little something about the angles and a little something about the distances, but you only know that for certain subsets of the environment, and therefore you're going to be quite bad at some of the judgments you would need to make. And then there's the view, which actually is the one that I endorse, that you can have both, that some adults are better than other adults at building real Euclidean-based cognitive maps, but that doing so is effortful, and that it's more likely not only for some people, but also in some circumstances. And I'll tell you more about that later. But this is a controversy about the mature state to which babies are headed. So now I'm in the second part of the talk where I want to actually fairly quickly, because I'm not going to describe the data in great detail, take you through what Piaget said and what Spelke said, and onto the cognitive map controversy. So Piaget said that children were initially not metric. This, I think, is false, but and I'm going to tell you this a lot. Things are false, but they contain grains of truth. They're not exactly right, but they're sort of right. We have some data, which I'll show you in a minute, from quite a long time ago, which suggests that even infants and certainly toddlers can code location metrically, but it's going to be limited. It is limited in several ways. It only lasts for a very brief period of time. You can only do it for one object at a time. It's not super precise. It's pretty precise, but it's not very precise, especially if it has to last a long time or be encoded for more than one object. It's relational. That is, you need something to a frame of some kind with respect to which to code the distance. You can't just do it in an absolute kind of way. And also what they don't do, but older children and adults do is a weighting in which you also have some categorical information, which is much rougher. Like it's kind of in the top left bit of this, table, but where exactly? And if you forget where exactly, you still know it's in the top left. That's what I mean by categorical coding. Now, most of the tasks in this literature are small scale. They're not really a navigable space, but I'm going to quickly tell you about them anyway. So this is the research that Jane Ellen Huttenlocher and I did a long time ago with Sandberg and later with Learmonth. With toddlers, we had a long sandbox, not very wide, so we didn't even consider dimension of the width of the sandbox, but we wanted something that would be smooth, where there was no, where you could really diagnose how metric memory for where you hid an object was. And of course, we needed a kid-friendly task. So we would dig in a toy in this sandbox. We'd turn the child around so the child couldn't just stare at where it was or, strain toward it. We had smoothed over the sand. So if you didn't see where it was hidden, you had no idea. We sometimes moved the kid laterally along the sandbox, things like that. We tried lots of variations. But what was true is that for one object at a time, when they only had to remember the time it takes you to turn around and turn back, which is about 15 or 20 seconds, they were great. They were pretty much accurate. You can see in this plot, they're sometimes a little moving towards the center on this side, and then on this side, they move towards the center of the box, which is categorical coding. It's in the box. I forget where, but it's in the box. And we had a similar thing in a way, but using a totally different methodology with babies as young as 5 months. Here, they don't move and they don't have good control of their hands, but what you do is so-called looking time experiments, where you monitor what they look at and what they seem to think is interesting or surprising. So you hide a toy several times in the same location, in and out, and then you hide it. But then lo and behold, you produce it from somewhere where it wasn't. And you see if they look longer. And what these graphs are telling us is, yeah, they look longer. And control infants who see the same old thing don't. And it's basically, you're inferring the baby's saying, and how did that happen? It was supposed to be here, and it's here. So that was the kind of thing that led us to think they do some metric coding. But only one object, only briefly. This is just telling you about only one object. So we started hiding two little plastic dinosaurs, identical plastic dinosaurs at a time, because whatever, little kids, you can't really tell them what to look for. Luckily, they also aren't very strategic. So sometimes they would look for the dinosaur we hid first. Sometimes they'd look first for the dinosaur we hid second. So that didn't matter. And what this graph is showing you in the dark gray is they look pretty well for whatever they look for first. But the young ones, the 18-month-olds, did not look very well at all in light gray for whatever they looked for second. It's as if finding the first one, that was it. And it gets better over age towards 3.5. It's never quite as good as the first one. And remember, this is a short interval. As the interval gets longer, they lose even that. And in Switzerland, the Lavenex lab has done other experiments. They actually don't use a sandbox. They use a larger, this is more like navigational space. You can actually walk around this enclosure. And there's many sort of round things, which if you step on them, emit a noise. Well, 1 or 3 or however many they programmed at a time make a noise. So then the task is to remember the ones that do that. And so when you have a memory load of 3, which is over here, you see some much later changes, more like at around 5 in that degree of metric precision, given that kind of memory burden. And John Spencer, who was at Iowa, but who's now in England at East Anglia, yeah, has called this the spatial precision hypothesis and has used it to explain various phenomena. I'm not going to talk you through this slide in detail at all, but just to draw your attention to this line of research out of the Huttenlocher lab that showed us that infants and toddlers need these surrounds. In the case of the sandbox is a frame. In the case of a test tube, the test tube is a frame, and you're judging height. If you just have a freestanding cylinder with no test tube around it, demarcating, oh, it's halfway up, it's a quarter way up, this kind of thing, it's not till you're pretty much school age that you really seem to encode metric extent. So you need that sense of comparison. And taking you back to that older work, this is actually some, on the left, I showed you this plot before. The little kids are pretty accurate, but they are squishing just towards the middle. Their only category is middle of the sandbox. When they're older, they have a category of the left half of the sandbox, the right half of the sandbox, so then they can correct by a category that's smaller, and therefore they minimize their error. So this relates to the precision hypothesis. And if it's a circle, in which case there's 2 dimensions, it turns out people actually use polar coordinates to code location in a circle. Children who are younger than 9 or 10 can code distance in from the circumference or out from the center, whichever, that kind of distance, or they can code angular distance. But if you press them to code both at once, they don't really combine those categories until late. So I hope you're getting the idea that Piaget was wrong, that little kids start entirely non-metric, getting the idea that he was kind of right, that it's not till 10 or so that they're showing fairly adult performance. So the sort of flip side of only using topological cues is that you're not using Euclidean or allocentric cues. And we've known for a long time that this is basically wrong. In the 1970s, Linda Accredalo showed that young infants will use allocentric cues as long as they're pretty salient, and or they can be less salient if they're really familiar. But what does seem to be true is that, again, they don't use them in sophisticated ways initially. And in particular, place learning, which involves repeatedly coming into an environment from different sort of vantage points, doesn't really appear until towards the end of the 2nd year of life. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And also, children don't adaptively combine this inertial navigation and these allocentric frameworks until late childhood, which is getting up to that Piaget age, right? Okay, so place learning. We did this a long time ago with the sandbox, which is making the kids go around to the other side of the sandbox, which is both a longer delay and also just more challenging because it's the same old sandbox, except you're on the other side. So right is left, left is right. They actually don't make right-left errors. If you're thinking that's what happened, it didn't. But we also either surrounded the sandbox with a white curtain or we didn't, in which case you could see there was furniture, there were windows, there was a door, etc. And what this graph is telling you is that for the little kids, the 16 to 21-month-olds, seeing those doors and windows and filing cabinets didn't help them. They were kind of okay at finding things. They didn't show incredible confusion, but the landmarks didn't help them. At the end of the 2nd year of life, 22 to 24 months, you can see that there was a difference, and that persisted after their 2nd birthday. So they're starting to use those allocentric landmarks. Those of you who study animals know that this is something that in animals you would assess with the Morris water maze. This is a Morris water maze that does not involve water, in which the kids have to look for a puzzle that's under some super cushy kind of tiles at the bottom of what actually is a swimming pool. And they come into this from various vantage points in full view of all these landmarks. And when they're younger than 21 months, they do really badly. Those are the dark bars. And when they're older, more towards their 2nd birthday, they at least do better. I mean, they're way far from being wonderful, but they're very markedly improved relative to what they were before. So although place learning will develop further into childhood, it is not really seen before that end of the 2nd year. And part of the reason for this is because they're starting to be confident walkers. What walking buys you is both that you need to find your way, right? Because you're going someplace and nobody's like pushing you or carrying you or anything like this. And you might say, well, what about crawling? Well, the trouble with crawling is you're mainly looking down, so you're not really using those external landmarks. And Melissa Clearfield demonstrated this some while ago. And it's actually Marco Nardini in Britain who's done a ton of work on this combination, Bayesian combination, that I recommend to your attention, but who showed over a decade ago that the combination of the inertial navigation cues with the allocentric cues really is late. We're talking much more than 9 to 10 kind of timing. So the last thing that I want to tell you about Piaget involves his projective space, which is being able to tell what another person will see from a different vantage point. John Flavel pointed out, again, a long time ago, that if all you mean is that a child recognizes you have to show something to a person so they can see it, not so you can see it, then that's early. That's like 18-month-olds. And here the child is showing a book, a particular mask, so that the observer can see it, not so he can see it. But the Piagetian task, which is much more complicated, involves being able to tell in sort of computational detail what another person would see. Piaget used 3 mountains. This somehow, you know, is, well, it's a schematic of the 3 mountains. And if you were sitting somewhere else, which would you see? Now, the way Piaget asked this turned out to be crucial. He would show 4 pictures, and you'd have to point to one. And this is very difficult. Children do not reliably pick the correct picture until they're 9 or 10. And early on, they mostly pick what they would see, which is where the light green big one is in front and to the left. They pick the correct view, which is where the smaller, darker green one is in front and to the left, if I'm correct, you know, much later. Now, you can convert this into a much easier problem by saying to the child, if you were sitting over there, what would be on your, and you can say in front of you, you can also say on your whatever side. With little kids, you have to put, say, an elephant sticker and say on your elephant hand side or something, but that works. And they can answer that question. They can say, oh, you know, the dark green mountain or whatever. But that's because you've helped them to structure what it is they're supposed to be focusing on, so they don't have to inhibit all the other information. Remember, I talked about inhibition earlier. So some work that Andrea Frick and Wenche Möhring and I did 6-7 years ago was to basically not only document, which really didn't need documenting again, that Piaget was right if indeed you give children all these different pictures to choose from, but also to sort of compile that into a test that we can use to assess children. I did want to mention that perspective taking is navigational. So even though we're talking about this small scale space, what people call vista space at best, we've known for a while from behavioral work, but more recently from some work out of Neil Burgess's lab on the neural substrates of navigation, that if you do extremely equivalent mental rotation and perspective taking, you either say, imagine this table spinning, or imagine walking around the table. You engage different bits of the brain, and it's imagining walking around the table that engages navigational bits of the brain. Okay, so on to Liz Spelke. So this paper that I put up here, which, you know, the curious can pursue, is an actual Bayesian model of what we think is going on, which is the idea that, as I've stressed for Piaget, that kids are better earlier than Spelke thought, that the transitions are more gradual than Spelke thought, and that they may well not be due to language alone, which does not mean that language is unimportant for humans. It just means it's not the only thing that's important. So some findings that led me to question the geometric module claim. It turns out that the finding that children do not use features, that is, do not use the red wall to go to the C for correct corner in which they have seen a toy hidden. That is, the long wall is to the left of the short wall, but it's also the short red wall. Spelke found that they don't distinguish the correct from the reversal corner, which is also the long wall is to the left of the short wall, but it's the short, same colored wall, until 5 years or 6 years of age. But she used a tiny room. in an only somewhat larger room, the size basically of a small bedroom as opposed to a closet, kids as young as 18 months do use the feature. So that's a big limiting factor on the Spelke finding. And I'm not going to go through these references in detail at all because this debate got basically more and more convoluted over the years. We have shown that children as young as 3 can use a colored wall and an octagon to distinguish among the 3 geometrically congruent corners, which was part of a debate with Liz. And this one I won't even mention at all. I did want to mention, because I know some people work with rodents in this audience, and I did with collaboration once or twice do a rodent experiment. This was because I wanted to actually look at the effect of early experience. We bring our kids up in rectangular carpentered rooms, and we bring our rats and mice up in rectangular cages. And is it that experience with these surrounding geometric enclosures sort of brings out the importance of them? So you can't really assign human infants where they're going to be reared. And, you know, you could try to look for babies growing up in yurts or something, but that seemed not possible. So we reared mice either in circular enclosures for 2 months with their mums, obviously, so they could survive, and with features. So half of it was blue and half was white, or in rectangles. And what we found was that the rectangular reared mice were not only more accurate at using geometry than the circular reared mice, but the circular reared mice didn't use the geometry at all. So you have to have at least some experience with the geometry to know how to use it, or alternatively, to know that it could usefully be used, which is a slightly different way to put it. But some experience is necessary. Okay, so this takes me on to Siegel and White and what I said about individual differences in cognitive maps and whether we get there and whether we only have cognitive graphs. And to look at this question and the question of individual differences, a group of us have been using a desktop VR. So this is not a virtual environment that's like incredibly helmet, immersive, all that kind of stuff. It's just something you do on your computer where you learn about. This is based on the Ambler campus of Temple University, but we came to call it Silkton. And you move around Silkton on a certain defined path, and you have certain buildings that you're supposed to learn about. So you go on one of the red paths, then the other red path, then on a blue connecting route, and then on another blue connecting route. And all of this is counterbalanced and so forth. And we then assessed how much they learned about Silkton by both a pointing task. Here's where you are. It's an on-site pointing task. You're in the environment, so to speak. You're looking at your computer. You're where you are. You want to point to Harvey House. So you move this bullseye around until you're pointing at Harvey House and you click. And also a model building task where you drag and drop outlines of buildings until you're satisfied that they're in the right configuration. And then we evaluate using a summary measure the accuracy of the map that you build. And what we find are very marked individual differences. So we have some people in the lower left that we call integrators who are only 10 or 20 degrees off, both at pointing to buildings that were on the same route and pointing from a building on one route to a building on another route. Then we have non-integrators in red who do point pretty accurately to points on the same route. That is, they learned the routes. That's sort of the Siegel and White-ish part of this finding. But they are much worse at the between routes. And then we have the people we call the imprecise navigators who are actually quite bad at both. So it really runs the gamut here. And we've used this with children as young as 8. And what we seem to find, I've just put these boxes here for when I mean, they're not wonderful, but on the average, they're similar to the overall performance of adults. And using pointing, we seem to see that that age of mature performance, as good as it's going to get, at least in the aggregate, is at about 12 years of age. And we see that also with respect to the model building data. So, that should ring a bell in terms of if kids on these small scale tests aren't looking really mature until 9 or 10, maybe when you have to push the system a bit and integrate many things over time and between roots, maybe around 12 would be where you'd get where you need to go. In terms of the idea of both maps and graphs, I've already obviously talked about individual differences just now, but in a review that we recently published, we also talked about the idea that different environments will more support the one or the other. So you're more likely to form a cognitive map in an open environment or in a gridded city, but less likely in a dense forest or a really complex building, especially if it doesn't have very many windows. So it's a matter of your access to things like global directional cues or organizing axes versus not. Because I could never get through a talk on this topic without somebody asking me about sex differences if I didn't mention sex differences, I want to say that we have recently done a meta-analysis of sex differences in navigation, and we find that yes, they exist. No, they are not as big as cartoonists think they are. They're about a third of a standard deviation, which means there's quite a lot of overlap between men and women. Many women are better than many men, but on the average, there's a bit of a difference. It's not nothing, but it's also not crazy something. That's what that means. And it's smaller than the sex differences for other spatial tests, such as this mental rotation that I've mentioned only briefly. Now, you might say, does it depend on whether you ask them to point or build an overhead map or et cetera, et cetera? We did in the article find some variation as a function of those things, but it's not enormous. You push it around a little bit and it doesn't make in my opinion, a whole lot of sense yet, given the database and the literature. What I did want to draw people's attention to is the fact that it emerges over time. So the blue sort of 3 points at the top is the average effect size for kids younger than 13, and the smallest, largest sort of value around that. And you can see that it's on the positive side of the little boys are a bit better than the little girls, but at this level of around 0.15 or so, you wouldn't really even want to say there's a sex difference you care about. It's later that you really see it emerging, which, by the way, does not by itself adjudicate between biology and social, but it constrains what kinds of explanations, either biological, social, interactional, you could possibly invoke. So you can't say something like, oh, it's prenatal hormones, not alone. You have to say something else. So that's it. I think I'm only a minute or two past the mark I was shooting for. This is just kind of a cartoon of what I showed you, well, a reminder of what I showed you before, and a reminder that the overview is this. And I want to thank the National Science Foundation, who funded most of this work, and thank my longtime collaborator, Jane Ellen Huntenlocker, with whom I did quite a lot of the work. And now I'm open for question.